statement at the same time, you're very welcome to do so. So please start.
Jane, you want to start? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Morris. I'm an architect. I'm the senior partner at Roger Stirk, Harbour and Partners, a firm of international architects, where I've been for the last 37 years. I'm the senior commercial partner, and I also chair the management boards of the practice and generally look after the day-to-day business to make sure that we keep afloat. I've worked mainly in the UK for the last 30, 40 years. Worked on a number of notable buildings that you probably would recognise. Lloyd's of London in the city, the Welsh Assembly Building, the O2 Arena, not the latest ramifications, but the first thing for the 2000 celebrations, Terminal 5, a number of residential projects for a number of clients for both high-end residential and low cost, and currently just completed a new distillery, whisky distillery in Scotland for the Macallan.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jane Richards. I'm a chartered structural engineer, and I head up the structural engineering division of WSP, and we're a large professional consultancy of engineering services. And like Andrew, my experience is quite general in building structures, but also quite specific in modular. So my involvement with modular and off-site design goes back some 15 years, and it includes developing a volumetric modular system for Unite Group, who provides student accommodation. And that was to take a product that was suitable for a production line facility through design development and out into manufacture. And when that product was completed in 2007, it was used by Unite on all of their projects after 2007. And it goes right through to current day, and some example projects I'm involved in now in modular and off-site include again a volumetric off-site product for the Berkeley Group, which is a large residential developer in the UK, and that product will deliver homes that go from 3 stories through to 20 stories. And we're also working for contractors who have an interest in off-site construction. That includes Laing O'Rourke and the Mace Group. So that's where I have experience in modular and off-site.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Johnston from a company called Bryden Woods. So we're an integrated design and operations consultancy. So we have all of the design disciplines, architects, mechanical, electrical, structural engineers. We also increasingly have a team of data analysts, mathematicians who do some very early stage problem statement writing, brief writing. So my career has been, Bryden Wood as a company was set up 23 years ago. I was employee number 1, and we were set up specifically to look at how we could import learning and best practice from other sectors, notably manufacturing, into construction, to start to get some of the benefits in terms of better quality, fewer people, better cost certainty, all those sorts of things. So my career has been sort of looking at that on a number of major projects. I worked on Heathrow Terminal 5, Athletes Village. We're currently working on the Ministry of Justice Prison Estates Transformation, which is the big new prisons estate. We've also had a particular interest in building information modelling and the sort of digital workflows that in our minds the digital and the physical are increasingly interlinked. So I was on the BIM task group when Level 2 was implemented from 2012. And I've continued to work with departments like the Ministry of Justice, moving them from firstly getting up to speed with BIM and then using that to drive better efficiency in terms of design and then ultimately in delivery. So my career has been very much spent trying to understand how we can import this best practice into construction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to ask the first question. We've heard from a number of previous witnesses about the various advantages, the benefits of off-site manufacture, and I'd like to ask you to say a bit more about what you view as the drawbacks and what are the barriers to off-site manufacture. Would any of you like to start? Yes.
I'll kick off. So I think the biggest barrier is the current fragmentation in the market, actually at every stage of the process, from design through to delivery. So what we're seeing in the design space is very deep but quite narrow specialisms emerging within the design disciplines, which means that you don't necessarily have a sort of controlling mind that has a complete view of every aspect of the design. And then once it gets out to procurement, you can do an awful lot of work to do a fabulously coordinated, integrated design, which then gets pulled apart into multiple individual packages, sent out to individual trades to price their bit of it. So what we see is increasingly people have a very narrow view of the overall problem. Potentially they've got quite a short-term interest in the project because they're only there for their bit of the design or their bit of the procurement. And all of that kind of fragmentation, the gaps between them is opportunities for, firstly, the client's desire or vision or requirements to be diluted, and then because there isn't that holistic view that's tying together the design requirements and the design and the means of manufacture, we're starting to lose opportunities. So what manufacturing does very well is capture the voice of the customer, and that becomes the thing that is persistent and drives everything. I think we're very, very fragmented in construction, and so no one has that kind of holistic view, and it makes it very, very hard then to get the level of integration that you properly need to drive a manufactured outcome.
I suppose what I'd add to that is, and I've mentioned my experience with Unite, so when it came to the 2008-2010 downturn in the industry, having invested hugely in a factory, a production line and a commitment to building that way, suddenly their funds weren't available for more development, and from a 3-day shift pattern at the factory, they went down to 0 and had to shut the factory for 6 months. And then when they took stock of that, they decided that just wasn't sustainable for them for the future. So they took the unfortunate decision that they were going to close the factory, put it into administration, and all that investment went. So I do think the industry has matured, and like Jamie says, there's a number of different aspects to it now, but I'm always mindful of that. But I'm almost surprised by how much investment there is by individual companies at the moment into this off-site. So it's clearly something that has an enormous amount of benefit for them as businesses. But at the same time, if we can't enable them to have a secure pipeline and a better understanding of how their commissions are going to come in, I think that's a really big drawback at the moment. And when you look at the people who are really investing, so the Barclay groups and Laing O'Rourke have actually just signed a development agreement with Stanhope, so that effectively secures quite a large 10,000 unit a year, I think it is, pipeline for them. Unless those sort of strategic pipelines can be put in place somehow, then I think there's a danger that it could stall. So I think if that could be addressed in some way, then that would be a benefit for all.
Lord Valence.
This touches on something we were talking about a little bit earlier. I mean, this seems to me to be as much a cultural issue as anything else. I mean, fragmentation is a fragmentation of cultures. The architects have cultures, designers, engineers, consultants, contractors, and you've got the trades, and so on. Now, if you're going to align a set of different cultures, you need real leadership there, and something which has leadership right through that chain. Is there any sign of that arriving?
Well, it was the point. I was going to pick up exactly on that point. I mean, the first thing you need is the willingness to change. You're absolutely right. And as Jamie said, although we talk about the construction industry in the same terms as we talk about aerospace or automotive, it's not really. It's actually massive infrastructure at one end and it's small domestic product at the other end. And each of those has their own silos of procuring their work, their own ways of working. It always tends to be traditional. And I think the first thing that one's got to get over is the desire and the willingness to make a change. And the only way that off-site can work is in combination with design for manufacture, which really means focusing on the end product, putting together the skills necessary that are concentrated on delivering the end product, and then the other most important thing is to devise a procurement process, which is a contractual environment and an insurance environment, that then enables that team to focus solely on delivering the end product. And that is a root and branch change. There are certainly pioneers, of which Jane has mentioned, that are trying to do so, but the vast majority of the industry are still very, very happy to stay where they are, and almost, I was reading the report from the NBS, the National Construction Contracts Tribunal, only recently, which has a very sorry conclusion, where they conclude that disputes, the people that have actually contributed to this survey, they take disputes within the construction industry as part and parcel of the way they work, which seems to be a damning outcome as to. So I agree absolutely. It requires a change of heart and a change of minds, but focused. And this, I think, is really where public procurement can offer a signal moving forward. It can actually produce exemplar projects. It can demonstrate and show the way and changes that need to be made. But I think, first of all, one needs to start to address the contractual arrangements and building contracts and the insurance regime to allow it to happen.
Chairman, can you indulge me just a slight?
Yes.
Just a quickie. Because to somebody who knows nothing about this market, that's me, all this argues for some form of vertical integration. So that, you have the whole chain there, and if you want to change the culture, you've got the levers to do it. Is anybody thinking about vertical integration?
I would just touch on here that the ICE, the Institution of Civil Engineers, of course, has a Project 13 initiative at the moment, and that is seeking to address this change in the industry. So there are initiatives happening, and they're being led from the top of the engineering industry for sure. So I think not everything is in place to make that sort of change that you've described there, but there are some initiatives there that should be encouraged and worked on to really, and also they are very wide-ranging, and they will take some time to fully change the industry. But I think a focus on off-site that comes out of those initiatives would be a useful thing.
So I'd say so we are seeing some clients address this sort of vertical integration now. So notably people like GlaxoSmithKline, where they've recognised that their attitude to risk has to change. So picking up on Andrew's point, at the moment, clients tend to put the risk on the tier ones, who then put some of the risk onto their supply chain, and so that gets passed down. I don't think we'll crack this until we can absolve some of the contractors of some of their risk, because at the moment we're asking them to do something very unusual. We're asking them to try out new ways of working, but the contractual tools say, but lump sum, fixed price. There's a constant tension there between the need to do the thing that I've always done to get cost certainty and the need that the client has to sort of try out something different. So where we're seeing it being successful is where clients are stepping in and saying, actually, it's still all my risk. I'll absolve you of some of that risk. I will start to take a much more active role in developing the brief, understanding the vision, understanding the supply chain, and I will take some of that pain away, and that then enables the behaviours that stop some of this dispute resolution and this hiding behind the contract. But Andrew's absolutely right. Until we get the procurement tools to work better, I think that's going to be very, very hard for people to make the contractual, the cultural shift, because they're just trapped at the moment.
And what incentivises clients to act in that way?
So I think companies like Glaxo have recognised that actually they're not getting a fantastic product from the construction industry. So I think they've recognised that actually, we looked at some of the figures from one of the big departments, and they found that of every pound they spend, only half ends up in residual asset value. The next biggest chunk is risk, and then they pay an awful lot of non-value adding money, which disappears into rework and profit on profit and transactional costs. So I think companies like Glaxo have said, look, if I could get closer to the actual asset cost, then I would immediately get buildings for an awful lot cheaper. What would I need to do that? What would I need to do to cut out some of this inefficiency? I need to step into that space. And so they're saying there is massive benefit. There's enough evidence, I would suggest, now to demonstrate that offsite can deliver projects better quality, cheaper, quicker, using more diverse people. But to do that, you have to step into that space and say, I will start to drive out some of the waste by understanding, putting in place a more efficient, as you say, vertically integrated process where the client, the voice, the customer is more persistent through the life of the project.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Sorry, Mr. Morris, did you want to?
I was just going to add to Jamie's point. I mean, when we were both involved in Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport, I think that was a classic example of where BAA, British Airport Authorities, were the client. They took on the full insurance risks. None of the consultants had to take out their individual policies. They put together a combined team of designers, contractors, supply chain, all in one place, so we were all together. And it was really a project team, because at the end of the day, I think they valued the quality and the cost certainty and predictability that comes from putting all that together. And the product is for you to see today, Terminal 5.
Thank you. Lord Kakar, you wanted?
If I may, Lord Chairman, I think question 6 sits quite comfortably here in terms of the focus of the discussion has been on what the client might do in terms of taking more risk, being more imaginative, therefore, in the way they contract and deal with the disposition of responsibilities. But is there more that government should be doing in terms of making it more attractive for clients to do that?
So what we're starting to see is, I would say, particularly Highways England on the Smart Motorways Programme, Ministry of Justice on Prison Estates Transformation have started to unlock some of these things. They've started to step into that space and demonstrate how this will work. What we're starting to see now is, I think on the back of the autumn statement, a piece of work which is looking at how you would take what MOJ and Highways have learned and spread it more evenly across the other departments. So Highways have got a load of learning which is potentially useful for Crossrail 2 and HS2 and HS3. So I think we're starting to see some of these big infrastructure clients talking more together. And we're seeing the same thing with MOJ is now talking to DIO. So we're starting to see a sort of cross-fertilisation. And I think that's being really helpful, that clients are starting to kind of self-reinforce, that if they can see someone else doing it and they can start to share their learning, that gives them confidence, and then you start to accelerate the pace of learning. So rather than lots of people learning the same thing individually in silos, we're starting to see much more of a sharing, which is then, the more we can open source that, the more we can make that learning available, the more clients, I think, will get some confidence and start to step in and contribute to that journey.
But beyond government being an important client, is there something that can be done by way of legislation that gives more confidence to clients, and therefore beyond that to the construction industry and participants more broadly who have to deliver this, or is that something that isn't necessary?
I don't know if it's necessary. We've struggled with this internally, because I'm not sure at the moment what you can actually mandate. So I think that at the moment, for instance, the term off-site is so broad that it's very, very hard to put a piece of legislation. So the measurement of what is off-site value versus on-site value is still very, very vague at the moment. I think there's probably not enough definition or articulation of really what we mean by off-site to then put in place some measures that you could then start to measure people against. So I know it's something the Infrastructure and Projects Authority are very keen on doing, is building up some benchmark data that you could then start to drive these behaviours. So I think in the long term, there probably is a legislative stance to be taken, but I think at the moment it would be so vague, it would be very, very hard to write a thing you could enforce.
Okay, we've got lots more questions. I'm sorry.
I was just going to add, actually, the government has indicated that it's expecting off-site to be a significant component of projects by 2019, which isn't far away. And I also think the other thing that I would add in is there are some massive regeneration projects out there, and projects like Barking, Riverside, 11,000 homes and that. So rather than put in place legislation, I think there's some real incentives that could be built into the procurement strategies and so on, delivering those projects so that they do automatically leave a legacy that's a benefit to the local community. And I think that off-site is such an obvious way to do that.
Thank you. Lord Fox.
When we were having the discussion about integrated teams, we seem to be conflating two things, because there are benefits from having integrated teams and there are benefits from off-site manufacture. And are you suggesting that we can't have effective off-site manufacture unless we have integrated teams, or are the two things actually two separate benefits, and you can still have the current fragmented model and still have effective off-site manufacture? So which is the chicken and which is the egg in this particular discussion?
My view is you have to have integrated teams to make this work. You won't do it until you have that sharing of knowledge.
Point. Yeah.
But I don't know if you agree.
I think how it's been done at the moment, we've still got some pioneers who are making off-site work. I think personally that to harness some of that and at least get the benefit of that cross-fertilisation of off-site technology and all that goes with it would be a good step. I think the whole integrated team, it works very well, and we've all got the experience of that happening, but I think to turn everything into every project to be done that way would be a big...
So coming back to Lord Carker's point, are there things that we could do around risk management legislation that would encourage the sort of thing that would deliver those teams? Are there legislative things that could change around risk management and insurance?
I mean, I think taking the lead from the Terminal 5 project, I mean, the way that consultants take insurance in this country, we work internationally, and quite often we find that on the major projects, clients are quite happy and prepared to take out project insurance, which is one single policy that covers the whole of the project. And therefore it means the individual consultants don't have to take out their own individual. Now, the simple act of doing that draws you together, because you then focus on the task at hand, and therefore I would have thought in any public project, if that project, the government, whoever is actually actioning it, can be seen as an exemplar client and put it in place, simply saying all public projects will be covered by project insurance, and therefore taking the risk away from the individuals. Just that one act, I think, unites the group, because you then don't spend half of your time trying to protect yourselves. You can absolutely focus on the job at hand.
I think you could go further than that, personally. I mean, I'm not advocating this, but we've had Chinese contractors approach us to, because they have been mandated by their government that a certain percentage of their residential development has to be done using modular off-site technology. Now, I don't think there would be any reason to do that, but you could take an approach that when you're procuring a very large regeneration public project, that if you think there's a benefit, particularly when there could be a legacy benefit, you could have that as part of the procurement, that this will be delivered with these outcomes in mind, and one of those could be an off-site legacy offer. So, coming back to your original question, I think there is a mechanism, a really beneficial outcome there if we put our minds to it.
Baroness Neville-Jones, you wanted a quick question?
Lord Fox covered the ground.
It's been
Chairman.
covered. Okay. Baroness Young.
Yeah, Lord Vance talked about leadership, and it does seem to me that this thing kind of could grow organically with lots of people doing little bits here, there and everywhere, or is there a kind of burning platform that's going to drive it, and if so, what would it be? Why does the efficiency case, for example, not drive it fast? Because of the benefits that people say it has in terms of the sheer efficiency of construction.
Well, I think you're dealing with a lot of individual vested interests. As I say, the industry is not one homogeneous sector. You should look at it as a series of silos that have developed over years with their own methodology and their own business models. And something that would work very much for commercial building in the City of London is totally inappropriate for domestic residential work. I think you have to look at how, in each of those sectors, what can you do to achieve the overall goal of off-site manufacture, which is greater quality in the end product and a shorter period on time, a better lifestyle, whole life costings, and therefore a better asset to invest in, and then tailor it for the various silos that you have. And especially if you look at the residential market, which is dominated obviously by the big house builders. You've got a couple of pioneers. James already mentioned Berkeley Homes are already experimenting and looking to see how they can introduce into their tried and tested method of building, handcraft, if you like, building houses. But the majority still abide by their own traditional ways because they don't see the benefits to them in their business model of additional quality and the whole life costing, because in essence they're building to sell. They have no involvement once they've sold that asset. It's where there's an investment and it's engaging the investor long term to see the benefits and get them drawn into delivering the end product in some way.
Baroness Morgan, you had a quick
Can I just
question.
come back to it? Ms Richards was exactly on the point I wanted to ask, really, which is, and you said you wouldn't recommend it, but why wouldn't we recommend that actually where there's large redevelopment, large regen, say Ebersfleet, I mean it's probably too late for Ebersfleet, but whatever the next Ebersfleet is, why wouldn't it be sensible for government to say, here's the deal, we actually want to really push productivity in the construction sector, so here, rather than just being publicly funded prisons, but we actually say, in this area of regeneration, this is what we want to see done differently.
Absolutely.
That's exactly where I could see it would be applicable. When I was saying I wouldn't recommend, say, a Chinese approach where there is just an arbitrary percentage,
Right.
say, in the future on all residential projects, you will use X amount of offsite. I think that's too broad, but tailored to a really good example where you can deliver, because there's all sorts.
Because you could demonstrate the impact.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's a capacity issue. I think you just create problems that way rather than really sort of focusing on good outcomes.
So,
Thank you.
Lord Griffiths, now I think we're going to move on to the next set of questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to about 6 questions ago from Lord Kaka. And that is the question, did we need legislation from the government? Our previous inquiry was on the industrial strategy. And listening to ministers, they seem to be quite proud of what the industrial strategy had done in the life sciences area, but also done in the construction area. And I just wondered if you were aware, I mean, given the success of Glaxo and BAA as champions of this approach, is there anything you feel government is doing through its industrial strategy in relation to the construction industry, which is bringing people together and being a sort of clearinghouse and so on for ideas and promotion of this approach?
So the first competition that's come out is for an innovation hub, which will presumably become the focus of all of these things coming together. So I think that's a massively positive step. And as we've talked about, I think there's lots of individually very useful, good pieces of work going on in little pockets. I think the idea of having this hub as a sort of clearinghouse, as you say, to bring it all together, start to cross-fertilise it, I can only see that will be massively beneficial in accelerating everyone's journey. At the moment we seem to have a massive duplication of efforts in lots of different pockets. If you looked at what happened in the American automotive in the 1960s, they had a huge collaborative effort. And so if we don't start to share best practice, if we don't start to socialise some of the things we're doing, we're dead anyway. So actually they started to share at a level and said, well, actually we'll be very cutthroat about how we carve up the industry after the fact, but let's do everything we can to maximise the size of the industry we're talking about before we then decide what to do with it. So I think this hub should be a massive step forward in starting to give everyone a repository for that knowledge, a place to get access to it, and as soon as one of the things we talked about earlier, as soon as you start lowering the barriers to entry so people can start to get their hands on this stuff quicker and sooner, I suspect that will massively accelerate everyone's journey. So I think that as the first competition coming out, I think that's a really good starting place.
Good. Thank you. Lord Borwick.
Can I ask about the business models in the construction industry, specifically the finance side of it? If you took something like a housing estate and compared conventional construction with an off-site construction, whose cash flow changes in which way? Does the client's cash flow change? And even take a big development like an office or a student accommodation, does the main contractor's cash flow change as a result of moving to off-site construction?
Do you want to kick off? Yeah,
I'll kick off. Yes, it does, because if off-site construction is to succeed, then it requires a much greater investment in design up front. So, and traditionally, because funding a major project is split into two halves normally, you would find that there's a funding profile and a cash flow profile for the early conceptual work, normally terminated with a planning application and a planning consent. And then once that consent is granted, then you find the long-term funder normally comes in and then funds the construction going forward. But of course, that causes a problem, because the long-term funder normally will only invest once he has somebody to transfer his financial risk to, and the only person
and security
out of security, and the only person who can carry that, or has a balance sheet big enough, is normally the contractor. But of course, then he's being asked to take that financial risk at a premature stage of the design. The design hasn't been complete, so there's a lot of guesswork involved. Therefore, unless that guess contains a lot of contingency, the likelihood the outturn cost is not going to end up anywhere near. And so that's the conundrum you have with off-site manufacture. When you're prepared to invest in design, you take the design process much further forward. You prototype, you test, you get predictability, you get greater certainty, which means that the cash flow is front-loaded to deal with the design process, but then because you have a much shorter period on site, it means that your cash flow is far less. Having said that, though, the difficulty is, and I come back to my original point on procurement, you then have a completely different procurement model, because the way that buildings are paid for are normally product, materials, workmanship on site as evidenced and signed off. But if all your work is actually off-site, then you've got to deal with the issue of payment, paying the various people who are putting all that together, making sure the ownership is sorted out, who actually owns the product if the contractor goes bust. So you've got a completely different arrangement. So providing you can get all that sorted out, and there's no reason why you can't, because many...
Now, I'm afraid that there's a division bell, which means that we're going to have to suspend the session for probably around 15 minutes, I'm afraid. So I hope you'll bear with us, and we'll resume.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently.
Apologies for that interruption. Not all of the members of the committee have returned, but we thought we should nevertheless resume. So I think Lord Borwick had asked a question. I think Lord Fox, you wanted to follow up on that. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Do please continue. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Your question really was about financing cash flow, I think. And I think that the simple answer is that yes, off-site manufacture, because there's a necessary investment in design up front, skews the cash flow that way. So therefore, you've got to be prepared to invest. But of course, the payback is the amount of time you spend on site is a lot less, and therefore the cash flow is eased. It eased at that point.
So it's sharper and earlier.
Correct.
Would be your
correct. And as I was explaining, certainly for commercial projects, that can cause a problem because the long-term finance, the construction finance, doesn't normally appear until there's a planning consent or there's a degree of certainty on the concept, and is not normally the same person that invests front end. So there's a temptation to reduce the amount of investment at the front end to get to the point where you can start investing in the long-term construction, but of course that requires a transfer of financial risk from the long-term investor to the contractor, and he will then needs to make up his mind on his price based on immature design information. So already you have a conundrum which inevitably leads to cost overruns, and is one of the major problems where you get cost overruns, because the budget, whoever set the budget to start off with and then committed his organisation to achieve that, had to do so on incomplete design information. And that's one thing that off-site manufacture does help.
Warwick, do you want to follow up?
Please, but other comments from the other two?
I think I'd concur with Andrew. There's a huge investment in off-site technology at the front end, and then the payback obviously just comes through each project after that. And only so many organisations could actually take on that level of investment, actually, and that's one of the big sort of drawbacks.
And it's the point that you made at the very outset about continuity of the pipeline being so crucial.
Yes. Yeah. I think the only other thing I would add on that is I referenced benchmarking earlier. I think there's lots of existing benchmark data for traditional construction, and so people can build up a cost plan at least based on relatively immature information. I think in the off-site space, because people don't have the benchmark data to rely on, they find it very, very hard to price it. And so whilst we as professionals would believe that it would demonstrate cost benefits, again, trying to get someone to price that, they will lump in a load of the risk for the things they don't know. And so at costing stage, very often the benefits aren't properly priced, and so that's a difficulty we run into quite a lot, that you know it will be cheaper, but you can't get someone to price it accurately at that stage. And I think that will change as we start to get more and more benchmark data. We start to do more and more of these projects. But I think it's a moment in time of the immaturity, I think, of the market.
Who should be responsible for getting that data?
I think the more people can start to publish the benefits. I think some clients, if they knew they were demonstrating cost savings, wouldn't necessarily tell everyone that. I think contractors, if they knew that they were delivering things cheaper, wouldn't necessarily publish that. They would probably try and keep the benefit. So again, I think things like this sort of clients forum, modern method construction forum, the working group within government, I think the more they can start to document the benchmark data, as I say, Infrastructure Projects Authority is leading on this and wants to build up that benchmarking case studies and publish them. I think the more we can start to publish these things, the more people will start to understand it, which is exactly what happened with BIM. People started to document case studies of where it had saved time and effort and reduced rework in projects, early adopters.
Okay, thank you.
A cash flow which demands cash much earlier and which increases the risk on that cash flow is probably two factors which are sufficient to slow the introduction of an otherwise bright idea. Would that be correct? That cash flow alone would be enough to cause what we are seeing, which is a slow take-up of an otherwise good idea?
Yes, I think so, and I think it comes back to my first point. Actually, I'm actually given that it's therefore surprising how much advance we've had in offsite, and I think that tells us something, that there must be huge benefits in there despite that, because I think we all agree we are at a point in offsite construction generally where there's a real momentum with it, and it's no longer something that is seen to be completely high risk and abnormal. It is starting to become more mainstream. So I think there's a real momentum to it now.
Okay. And then Baroness Neil-Jones.
One of the things I'm trying to work out is to what extent are the methods used by the different companies or groups secret, and to what extent is the government, as it were, or the Building Research Establishment or whatever, establishing methods or methodologies that will be common across the industry. And I'd be interested to know whether, in fact, there is more common practice in other countries, whereas I think the impression I've had from you is that it's all still quite secretive in the UK. And the role of the BRE or any other government body doesn't seem to be one of kind of enforcing openness.
And you asked me that question earlier, and in the private sector, there's much more secrecy, because obviously that investment we've just been talking about is an individual company's investment, and so we are tied to contracts where we can't share that information. And I know Laing and Hurcomb are going to be in your next session. They have recently published quite a large body of research that they have done on accreditation, design coding, and to get some commonality across the industry. Now they've published that research so that it's for all to use, because they actually see their gain, or everyone's gain is actually their gain with that, because the more it does gather momentum, the more people are using the same information rather than having to spend a lot of effort developing their own equivalents of that. Actually, everyone will benefit. So, I mean, I would point...
Is the government pushing that, or is that not? It's not on their agenda.
I think in the hub that Jamie mentioned earlier, but I think more can be done there. So one thing I would say out of this, and it would be quite a small thing, if we could encourage a way of sharing and disseminating that type of information, that would be a really useful thing for everyone.
So one thing we had written into the contract on the Ministry of Justice Prison Estates transformation is that any IP we generate immediately goes to the Crown for use in perpetuity for any purpose whatsoever. So actually, rather than try and secure that IP for ourselves, we're saying actually the benefit comes if more and more people start to adopt this. So we're trying to publish We've put out a number of publications over the last year or so under the...
Sorry, who's we? Is this your
so Bryden Woods, anything we've done in the public sector, we've been documenting and publishing via the Digital Built Britain, Cambridge Centre for Digital Built Britain. So we've been trying to publish our workflows and the outcomes of the things we've done. We're ensuring that any IP we generate on public sector projects is then documented and owned by the Crown, whether it's for Ministry of Justice or Highways England. So we recognise that that is the thing that will start to increase the uptake, is the more we can open source the things that we can do. There's quite a few people who wouldn't necessarily have the skill set to develop something from scratch, but they could certainly contribute or build on something that's already available. So we see that's the way that we'll start to, say, lower the barriers of entry.
Would it be helpful if this committee kind of endorsed that in some sense? Or
yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I think we can't. It'd be wrong to generalise too much here, because some developers are very much of that mindset. They can see the benefits of that, and even going back to my Unite days, they allowed us to publish technical paper, and I've co-authored one on modular design in high-rise buildings, and it's so there are pockets of this, but it is very ad hoc. I think something that made that a general would be really advantageous for everyone.
So, I think if you built that into public sector procurement and said that rule applies, that all IP generated for public sector procurement then becomes public, I think you would start to see a massive uptake in this, and you'd start to see a huge contribution of people building on these things.
Is that being done in other European countries?
I don't know if anyone else has tried that.
No, I don't. I mean, our experience working around the world, having denigrated our industry, is actually quite sophisticated compared to some of the places we've worked in. North America, both Canada and the United States, it's a much more industrialised process, and it's much more standardised, but they do concentrate on design. It's where we were 30 years ago. They don't actually start constructing until they've got a fair amount of design done. Germany is exactly the same. They get a lot of the design done before they actually commit to construction. But I think that they're nowhere near as sophisticated as our industry. I think our industry can still respond to whatever it throws at it. Providing you can provide a procurement strategy to deliver it, it normally does it excellently. Our experience around the rest of the world is that you are shaped by the industry, so therefore you have to fit in very much to the product that it is offering. And I think the reverse is in
Baroness
the UK.
Jones.
Chairman, I should just say I have no interest in clear in connection with this inquiry. The point that you've just made is what I wanted to ask about. It sounds from what you've just said as if one of the things that happens is that there's very considerable consolidation in the industry, so that you get less variety, and presumably harder for minnows to grow to compete with big boys supplying big integrated projects. Is that a risk? Because I can see, that the need for capital up front and sorting out risk is a barrier to actually getting the thing going. But I do wonder if there isn't down the road a downside in extensive consolidation of a kind that actually narrows choice and makes it hard for small companies to grow and get in the game.
Well, there doesn't have to be. I mean, all the discussion we've had, based on our experience this afternoon, has been on large-scale projects. We're working with Lewisham Council at the moment on a small residential, what they call pop-up.
That's what I wondered. They get reduced to being in the small game rather than the big game.
Which is 24 units, low cost, less than £5 million for the overlot. 95% of the project is off-site manufactured. And the work that we've done with Lewisham Council there is a modular system, it's a volumetric system, but it's low tech. It's a timber-based system, and the idea will be that rather than having to regionalise the assembly points, so that you can actually make good wherever you've got the housing project to put, you can actually utilise local labour, local material at a low key level in a modular off-site manner. And we think that has great advantages. Yes, at the other end of the scale, you've got the Laing and so forth who are dealing with large, big commercial projects, and therefore they're investing in a different way. But I think at the other end of the scale, I think there is plenty of opportunity that off-site manufacturer does give to diversify or regionalise the production, especially in the residential market.
Yeah. Okay. It sounds as though the industry would end up being differently structured, but I still ask the question. You know, I mean, some of these big giants now started as pretty humble construction companies.
Yes.
Will that continue to be the case, or will you get a layering of the industry, you know, such that you've got the big boys and then you've got people who do local stuff? And you've got
I think you always will have. I mean, people start up. I mean, Tom Bloxham, who was a developer who started Urban Splash, that you may have heard of, concentrated a lot of work in Manchester, specialised in developing and in that area, has just recently started up his own construction company based on prefabricated modular units. And I think because the industry is divided into so many sectors, there's always going to be opportunity. Not so much in the big sector, because you need big investment, you need lots of bodies, but in the smaller sector growing, I think there'll always be that opportunity. And I think especially now, with the new technological innovations in computing and BIM, 3D printing, manufacturing and technology has never been easier to put together. And again, that spills over to the sort of skills that one can actually start to attract, becomes more attractive for younger people because it's more technology based. So I think there is every opportunity through off-site manufacturing, the allying it with technology, to start to diversify.
So you don't see any real danger of an anti-competitive situation arising? No. Very, very small number of companies competing?
Because we're designing buildings down at much more component level, so they're kind of manufactured components rather than things that are made by skilled craftsmen on site. We're actually seeing a much more diverse supply chain, because suddenly you're not looking at buying systems from very specialist people, you're looking for individual components, and actually the supply chain for those is very broad and very wide. As Andrew says, then you can actually procure things much more locally. And then the skills required to assemble these things, we've demonstrated on a number of projects now, you can start to engage again, a much more diverse workforce. So rather than need skilled craftsmen, just in the way that Jaguar Land Rover cars are made by people who've been trained in specific tasks, you can take a whole range of people who wouldn't traditionally think of entering construction, be it people returning to work or apprentices. Suddenly your supply chain and your labour force gets very diverse, very broad. So I think we won't see a consolidation. I suspect actually we'll see much more of a distribution. And you can see projects like Heathrow, where they're very deliberately trying to spread the economic benefits out into the regions. So for a massive piece of infrastructure in the southeast, they want to spread that benefit. I think we'll start to see more of that happening, potentially build up quite a distributed network of manufacturing capability, and you can procure things much more locally, you can engage in much more local, more diverse workforce. So I think actually we'll start to see a huge diversification in the industry.
I think that's a really good point, actually, and I think we, in a way, off-site suffers from being so broad, and that when we talk, sometimes we talk a lot about the really big, sort of high investment, volumetric, modular, or the Steepley factory that I know you'll be visiting. It's actually about components being made off-site, and that can be taken to, you know, quite a granular level, and it can still bring benefit to the overall construction process.
That sounds less integrated, if I might say so.
No, Jen, sorry. Could we have Lord Fox has a question, and then Lord Fox.
You should let Brandon's officers make the time.
I was actually going to take up what you had asked, the question you had asked about, don't you need integrated teams, to which the answer was yes. Now we're hearing, now you can have diversification. I'm very unclear which it is.
Can I just pitch in on that? And why would the sourcing necessarily be local? When you look at the aerospace industry, the way in which they drive costs is for the simple components. So let's say you have a universal tap. You wouldn't buy it in this country, you'd buy it from India. So what drives local sourcing? On the contrary, once you have standardisation, it drives international sourcing, not local sourcing.
So I think it gives you the choice. So what we're working through with MOJ is starting to look at standard components that can do multiple building types. So if you can use a component that is good for schools as well as healthcare as well as residential, then you start to build up the numbers that you need, which gets you into manufacturing space, and then you can decide where to procure it.
Yeah, but what you said necessarily this allows local procurement. On the contrary, it absolutely makes international sourcing much more economic and the far more likely route that people would take. Surely.
So you can, if that's where you want to. You could go and buy things internationally. What we're seeing
actually,
you
can buy things internationally cheaper.
Well, what we're seeing is that on the first iteration of some of the components we devised, we had them fabricated fairly manually from small local fabricators. The next iteration, we found a company that did CNC cutting, and the cost immediately plummeted because they said, actually, I could do those a lot cheaper using technology that's available. And then the third iteration, they get cheaper again because that local person says, actually, if you made the components slightly differently, it would be even easier. So what we're starting to find is that we can design towards specific bits of the supply chain. Once you've designed those and you've optimised those, you then go, right, let's buy them from anywhere who has the capability to contribute. And actually what we're seeing is rather than buy millions of them from China and pay to ship them, you can buy 100,000 from lots of small local people very, very close to where you're using them. So if we're using standard components that get used across the entire country, you can decide to procure those particular components. You've already optimised them and you've already designed them towards a manufacturing approach. Actually, it then becomes really sensible to buy them quite close to where you need them, using local skills, using local people. My guess is that if we decided to, we could use that to put more investment into UK manufacturing and bring up the entire manufacturing base of the UK rather than send that investment across the
But that
world.
would be a political decision rather than an economic decision.
Well, I think the other thing that I've been reading about this recently, there is some thinking that suggests we're past peak globalisation. So for years the narrative was everything was heading out to Asia because the cost base of doing it was cheaper out there. They've actually got, China particularly has got a more of an ageing demographic problem than we have.
That's why I chose India.
And but I think the same thing will happen. You'll start to see a rising middle class, so the cost differential in labour will start to get less. And then once you look at additive manufacturing, automation, once you get into robots, the cost of a robot is pretty similar wherever the world it is. So we're starting to see a thing in the States called reshoring, where companies who traditionally would have sent things to China and Asia are bringing them back into the US, because actually the cost differential doesn't stack up anymore.
There's a lot of different dynamics.
Can I ask, Lord Kakai?
We've taken Lord Chairman question 6 earlier, but just one further point, if I may. In terms of all of the intellectual property that might be generated from the technological solutions that you've described earlier and digital solutions, how important is that the government has a strategy to keep the development of those peripheral businesses that hold that technology and that IP in the UK, or does it not matter if they're taken, invested and developed abroad?
I think they should be taking steps. I'm not sure that's been thought about yet, because it's very emerging thinking that's coming out through some of these initial public sector programmes. I think one of the Construction 2025 targets was to massively increase exports. So you could tackle that export question by sending these things out, procuring abroad. It could be that you send the processes, the IP. I don't think anyone quite knows yet. But I would agree, I think it's something that government should have a strategy for. If it starts to accumulate this IP, it should work out what to do with it before it loses control and it goes too open source too quickly and it loses its ability to exploit that in some way.
Do either of you two wish to comment on that?
Sorry, please.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of the IP, it does need to be protected. I mean, from my experience in the private sector, that's one of the reasons there's so much secrecy around it. I have to say, it's the technology for off-site construction is actually quite simple. The methodology for construction is by its nature, that's what you're designing it to be very simple, very standardised, very able to be repeated and easy to use. So in a way that's a bit of a dilemma with it, that you're trying to protect something that's actually very easy to copy and very simple. You've made it simple. So I think all of the tooling and some of the digital technology that goes with the production can be more complex, but what you're building itself is quite a simple thing. So that is why people are so protective about it at the moment. But any assistance that can be given with that and enforcing that so that it can actually be used but not copied is obviously going to benefit those people who invest in.
Mr. Morris, anything to add?
Well, the only thing I'd add, IP, it depends what you mean, because there's a lot of intellectual property in the actual conception of the product, how it looks, what it feels like, what it's going to do, and being an architect, that's very sensitive to that. Giving that away is like giving the crown jewels away. But one understands if when you're involved in public procurement, or even when we was on Terminal 5 at BAA, there comes a point where the project is so large that you have to vest that IP with somebody else. When it comes to IP in relation to process, how you take that conception and then put it together and the processes you use, I don't think there's so much of a problem there, because a lot of the wherefore, if you like, of how that is done is common knowledge. I mean, now the use of BIM, 3D printing, a lot of the process of actually applying that knowledge to deliver and manufacture components is fairly standard stuff. So I think one needs to differentiate between what it is you actually want to save and become part of the public realm, and on what you're quite happy to share and give away.
So I think what we've got, Lord Valence, you had a question. We've got 2 more questions to deal with in the last few minutes.
No, I can pass.
That's very kind. Thank you. Baroness Morgan, on skills.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Can I just say, I think it'd be really helpful if you read the transcripts of what you've just said about IP and what you said earlier about open source, because I think we've had really contradictory stuff, even from your own mouths, with respect. So, and I understand why, because it's a complicated issue and it's hard to differentiate exactly what we mean. But I think clarity around that issue for us would be helpful, and I'm sure it'd be helpful if you read it and maybe sent in other thoughts on it. On skills, I mean, by all means, answer this pretty briefly, because I suspect we broadly know where you'll be on this. I mean, clearly there's already a shortage of skills on site that's likely to get worse because of an ageing construction population and falling EU workforce. So we know there's already a problem. How do we manage the existing construction industry while also reskilling in the way that we know needs to change quite dramatically, actually, for the sort of future world, if you like? And do you accept it needs to change, the skill base?
My personal view would be that I think the existing industry will carry on doing what it's doing while this sort of emerging new industry starts to take over. So actually I don't think there's an issue of having to re-skill the people we've got. I think we're engaging a completely new set of people and bringing them into the industry, and while the skills gap and the ageing population tapers off, it just gets replaced by this sort of new and emerging industry.
Yeah, I think, and I think you alluded to it earlier, but my experience, particularly going back to Unite and their factory in Gloucestershire and Stroud in Gloucestershire, actually that all came from a local workforce. The skills needed for an off-site technology tend to be different, but less when you compare it with a traditional trade on site. So actually you can really impact on a local area when you set something like that up, and it doesn't take so long to skill people up to deliver that, because it's a factory process. We're talking about factory process here, and it's something that doesn't require that level of trade skill that an apprentice approach would typically need.
But presumably there must be a higher level of more digital skills that aren't necessarily there as much at the moment.
Yeah, but I think that's becoming part and parcel of our
everything.
industry anyway.
Yeah,
that's the world we're in now.
Okay. Mr. Morris, anything to add?
Yes, I was actually just going to make the point that James just made. I mean, if you look at current manufacturing at the moment, it's quite common that the drawings that we produce are almost the drawings that go into the patterning machines and you direct them from. So there is already a lot of technology that goes in. I think once you start to move into the other realm of 3D printing and all the other next generation of manufacturing, then I think then you start to look at reskilling. But At the moment, what we make off-site is in essence what they make on-site, but in much cleaner, controlled environment.
Yeah.
You're still welding, you're still bolting, you're still bending tin, you're still cutting timber, you're still screwing, you're just doing it in a much more healthier, safe environment.
I think we're drawing to a close, but Baroness Noel-Jones, you have a question about architectural ambition and standardisation.
It seems to me that from what we've heard, that if the industry develops in the way I think that you would like to see it, with much greater integration of the process, that seems to me that would likely to lead to quite a lot of competition on price. How does that, which can lead to some pretty, I suspect, some pretty boring buildings. How do you keep architectural ambition and design alive when those pressures are around, and when your client wants a deal on the cost of the building?
I'll kick off on that. Well, I think I just stated the Leadenhall building, which is the building that I mentioned in my introduction, is the building commonly known as the cheese grater in London. That is a classic example of off-site manufacture. 83% of that building was actually made off-site. Laing were the main contractor. In fact, we could have done a lot better, because the journey of that building is one of two halves. It started off under one procurement regime, stopped, and then was picked up. If we'd have started from the beginning, as we ended, directed at off-site, we could have improved. That building saved 6 months off of the 3-year site contract. It saved 7% on the actual construction cost, and the time that was saved at the back end enabled the building to be let, and I think KPMG worked out that it added something like £29 million worth of value for the client in terms of the rental stream coming in early. Now, that building was voted by the BCI in 2015, 2016, the best office building in the UK. I make all these points to say that we, as a practice, do not see off-site manufacture as restraining design creativity. At the other end of the scale, I think there's perfect opportunity in the low-cost housing market to use the design talent that is preeminent in the UK. That's the one thing that we have in abundance. Probably too many architects if we're looking at a competitive front. The constraints that we're talking about in terms of integration is really integration of knowledge, integration of data, working with the people who are going to make the components and learning from them, letting the delivery of the product influence the concept of the product, and keeping that circle turning. We think there's every opportunity, as we've proved as a practice. I think even the first building I worked on, which was the Lloyd's Insurance building, a good proportion of that was made off-site. That was 30 odd years ago. All the concrete columns and the toilet pods that fitted in, that was taken off-site manufacture to its extreme over 30 years ago. So I think we believe as a practice that it shouldn't stifle creativity. It gives the opportunity of the conceptor and the designer to work with the deliverer and the people that are going to manufacture, which can only help the quality and functionality and still be able to express a great aesthetic object.
So you don't see a danger of a lot of boring building punctuated by the odd outstanding one?
No.
Well, if there is, I would just ask you to look around now.
That's exactly what I see.
Because I think there already is, and I would like to think that a lot of lessons could be learned by going off-site and actually perhaps improving what we currently have.
Thank you very much. Would the other...
Can I just build on that? Because I think this is a really important point. So my view is if we don't embrace this technology, we're more likely to get sort of dumbing down the design. So if you look at the IPA talks about a £600 billion pipeline, UN talks about 2.5 billion more people living in cities by 2050. I think the scale of the design challenge we're facing, if we don't adopt these new technologies, then we'll end up with poor design just because no one's got the time to do it properly. I think a much more positive take on this is that the history of architecture is kind of built on every new architectural movement is a response to some form of technology. So tall buildings couldn't exist until we had steel treated in a particular way. Then lifts had to be invented. I think there's a...
The elevator.
Yeah.
That was the key.
I think there's a really interesting question, which is if architects are very good actually at dealing with constraints and being constructive within constraints. I think there's a really interesting space that we're potentially looking at a new form of architecture. Because if you embraced all of these tools and if you understood the method of manufacture, what we're finding is that things like BIM, because it documents the building quickly, we have more time at the front end to do the proper design exploration and understand more design options. So I think actually there's a potentially really positive space where we start to develop a new form of architecture that understands these tools, uses these methods of manufacture. There's a whole generation of 8 to 12-year-olds who are playing Minecraft, using standard components, co-creating in a 3D space and designing all sorts of interesting things. So I think there's a whole generation who, if we don't get this right, won't come into construction. But if we do get this right, we'll pick up this technology and do things with it that we never would have conceived.
That's a very positive note on which to end. Sorry, Ms. Richards, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think those two answers were covered. All I would say, just to maybe counter it slightly, is, if we go back in history and we think, particularly with residential, a lot of our residential development, Georgian, Victorian, is, pattern book approach, and none the worse for it. We just need good design and, actually linking that with the newer technologies that we've been talking about. Actually, it doesn't need to be a negative, but we need to force that through and make sure we get good design.
Thank you very much. You've been really excellent witnesses, and we really appreciate it. And I must apologise for the disruption earlier on. Thank you for bearing with us, and thank you very much for coming to speak to us. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much for bearing with us. I do apologise for the delay, but you probably know that there was a division, and so we had to stop the proceedings of the previous session in order to go and vote. And unfortunately, it looks as if it's going to happen again. But I nevertheless feel that we should make a start, and because we know we have a a lot of things that we're interested in hearing from you, but I do apologise that we're probably going to have the same thing happen, that we'll have to stop and then resume probably about 20 minutes later. If you could bear with us, but we're so sorry about that. Could I start by asking you just to introduce yourselves, each of you, and if you wish to make any sort of statement as part of that, then please feel free to do so. So, Dr. Williamson, why don't you start?
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Williamson. I am Technical Director with Laing O'Rourke. I've been with Laing O'Rourke for the past 6 years, and for the past 3 years predominantly I've been working on the Hinkley Point C project at Sizewell as part of the bylaw JV with Bouygues Travaux Publics.
Good afternoon. I'm Martin Kelly. I'm the Strategy Director with Severfield Group. Severfield is a structural steelwork provider, and structural steelwork is one of the sort of longest standing proponents in the off-site environment. So we've been working in a factory environment and delivering work to sites since the 1970s.
Good afternoon, my name is David Hurcomb. I'm the Chief Executive of NG Bailey. We're a company that operate in the mechanical and electrical installation and maintenance space. We're a family-owned company, been going nearly 100 years. We started getting into off-site assembly manufacture about 17 years ago, and a real champion of it. We'd like to see lots more of it, so we're delighted to come and speak to the committee today.
Thank you. Well, before I ask the first question, I should declare an interest in that I have an association with Laing O'Rourke. Laing O'Rourke are very closely connected with my university, and I just ought to make that clear. And I'm also a consultant to Laing O'Rourke, although I have very little to do with off-site manufacture. My work with Laing O'Rourke is more to do with underground construction and tunnelling. But I just thought I should make that clear. So my first question is, can you tell us about, we've heard a lot about the advantages of off-site manufacture. Can you tell us what you see, what are the barriers to the wider uptake of off-site manufacture? Who would like to start?
I think it's an understanding within the design community of how to design for manufacture. Most of the designers will have been trained many years ago in very traditional methods, and therefore they don't have the knowledge and expertise in how to design for manufacture. I think the commercial reality is it is of no real interest to them to do that if their clients are not seeking that. Therefore, it is usually the contractors and the actual companies that physically install and build these buildings who get the most benefit in terms of programme and certainty, things like that. So I think there's a commercial reality there, and I think there's a knowledge and skill. So because we are still very fragmented between design and then construct, unless you have design and construct within the same envelope, it's really hard to influence the client. That would be my headline.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
I would agree with that. I would also make the point that there's also something fundamental about the nature of the construction industry. It's a very large, fragmented industry, and the knowledge base that exists within that is equally fragmented. And there is a circularity.
I'm so sorry. Already we are being interrupted. I do apologise. We'll have to stop the session, and if you be patient, we'll be resuming in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Do apologise for that disruption. We certainly plan to finish by 6, and I hope that's okay for the three of you. And I apologise for the disruption that we've just been experiencing. Now, I think I think Dr. Williamson, you were perhaps we've lost the flow a bit, or was it?
Were you still in flow?
I was just.
I'm so sorry. You were speaking. Please, if you can remember where you were, then please continue.
So I was following on from what David said. I think there are sort of three main areas why there are barriers. One we've talked about with regard to design. I think there are challenges to off-site methods being specified from a design perspective. I think there is a challenge from the industry generally, which is that it's very fragmented. Often the players are quite small and not always suitable to adopt off-site methods. Thirdly, I think there is an issue with the contractual structure of the industry. It tends to be in silos, and the way that similar trades work together is not as effective as it could be. And I think what's required is that there's a circularity with all of that, which is that, we can't demand that designers design off-site solutions, because they will turn to the industry and say, but off-site solutions aren't fully available, and therefore it carries on. And that's the real challenge for the industry, which is that how do we break the circularity of an adoption that hasn't fully taken place.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Williamson.
So I agree with much of what David and Martin have said, and I think in many instances the barriers are to do with a perception issue, so potentially cost. So rather than seeing the benefits in terms of consistency of product, reliability of programme, reduced reliance on the traditional construction skills, what comes across is an increased upfront cost, and then perhaps in many areas a perception of a quality perception. People have in their minds the prefabrication, which of the 60s, 70s builds that happened post the Second World War, which are not at all like the componentised offering of off-site construction that we see today. So I think there is that perception, and in terms of organisations who are providing modular or off-site offerings, then there is a significant difficulty in seeing a pipeline. So there's significant investment required in order to develop componentised solutions, whether it's structure, MEP, whatever. Without a visibility and a demand, then it takes something to push that investment forward. I think there are other components in that as well, which there's a regulatory, perhaps a regulatory influence. I know from my own organisation, we have some success with private clients who can really see the benefit of that certainty in programmes. So, for example, a residential developer who wants to know when they will be getting rental income, they will quickly and clearly see the benefit of having having a componentized solution, which they can see that built virtually before we start to bring a lot of things into this. So the componentization lends itself to BIM, or what we call digital engineering. We get to the point where we have real security of program, of assembly sequence. So an enlightened client will see the benefit of that, because in a very short space of time they will have a realised program which is giving them income. In other areas it's more difficult to get that traction. So speaking from my own recent experience in a regulatory environment, there's a massive drive towards safety, which there clearly should be, but with a slight twist that could move towards componentisation and modularisation, which gives an industry which has traditionally struggled with cost and programme the opportunity to get that programme reliability. So I'm sorry if that was rather long, but there are a number of I think very intertwined barriers to the uptake of off-site manufacturing componentisation.
Thank you. Baroness Young, is there anything you want to ask?
Really taking that around the other way, I mean, is there a single bullet? Is there a big breakthrough? Is there a leader somewhere out there that could break into this cycle and make it happen? Because at the moment it's going round with a small amount of incremental change, but it sounds as if that could take a very long time.
Who would like to answer that? Mr. Kelly.
I'm sure we'll all have a view. My view is that there needs to be a client who starts that circle, because it's not for the supply chain to offer, it's for the client side to demand. And there are a number of ways that we could start to think about that circle. One is that certainly the public sector is a client itself, and therefore if it chose to, it could be more prescriptive about what levels of off-site are required in public procurement projects. Similarly, it could incentivise private developers to take a more off-site approach, in which case, again, you would see that top-down drive for pushing their designers to specify off-site, which would, of course, have the recurring reaction of the supply chain providing the right solutions.
What sort of incentives would you see that comprising? How would you incentivise the private developers?
Well, that would, it's almost, you're looking at sort of perhaps tax incentives. You could look at sort of an extension of R&D type tax credits, that you're driving a different level of behaviour. For example, it was very effective in the construction industry when public sector projects insisted on adopting BIM. Now that has actually worked its way through, that it's not just public sector projects that adopt BIM, it's actually a good thing to do, and a huge number of private sector projects adopt BIM. Completely, so the kickstart that came from that public sector requirement gave everyone enough time, understanding, and sort of financial incentive to be able to say, okay, I'm prepared to develop our understanding of BIM, and I think you could get something similar in offsite.
Dr. Williamson, do you have a view?
I think I support that, and I think in terms of government procurement, there is a huge opportunity where for government to use their buying power, so public projects, but also I think there's something about planning and development. We've got two ends of the scale. I think we can look at projects like we've done lots of modularisation and off-site for highways projects, HS2. We've got examples of crossrail projects where the benefits have been clearly seen. And at the other end of the scale, there's a huge opportunity in the housing market, which seems to be doggedly sticking to its guns and brick building everywhere. However, if you look at there have been requirements for developers to build affordable houses. So why not drive a bit of innovation and thinking into that part of the market and ask them to consider off-site quality of design and other criteria than are currently required.
Lord Hunt?
Seems, is it not possible that wholesale companies could exist which will make all sorts of beams and other elements, so that small builders, as it were, can continue, but then they will actually get these significant components? And my impression is that on the continent that happens. It certainly seems that in France you have lots and lots of houses, all of which have got very similar components, but they're designed differently. So there is some company or organisation which is producing all these components. But are there companies in Britain doing wholesale construction and marketing of building components?
No, not at the moment. I guess in the UK it's very much about control of the land. Once you've got the land, you've got the real key resource. You then will want to sell your design, which is manufactured to a cost to allow them to make the return. So there isn't a wholesale provider of the bigger components, I would suggest. Obviously roof trusses and all things like that will be very standardised, but the actual layouts of the actual properties.
And do you not think that's going to happen in the future? I mean,
potentially. It's
to some degree elements of it already have happened. But it is things like SIPs, it's things like roof...
Things like what? SIPs?
Structural insulated panels, where you sort of got roof panels, where you've got roof trusses that are sort of pre-manufactured. Where you can get sort of elements of pre-manufacture. And I suppose the example of those two is that, and this is perhaps one of the challenges, is that when you're looking at a single trade, so roofing is a single trade, roof truss is a single trade, it's much easier because we tend to be specialists in our own area. So when you've got something that you can prefabricate, so if you take my example of my company prefabricates steel, but that's all we limit ourselves to prefabricating steel. We couldn't move into the MEP space, we couldn't move into the concrete space, because that's all we know. And really, I think one of the challenges is that most of these components require an understanding or potentially a working with other trades, other specialists, and that's something we haven't encouraged in the UK.
Yeah, that seems very... Anyway, it's clearly different, isn't it, in other countries, in some of the other European countries in this respect.
Yeah. I think in Sweden, for example, there's 85% of properties use off-site prefabrication. So there's a massive opportunity in the UK.
So Lord Griffiths and then Lord Fox.
I mean, it's incredible.
Can I thank you for the evidence you've given? What's interested me from this session and the previous session, where we had people who are intimately involved in the industry, is that people quote one example after another, quoted HS2 and so on, the highways, they quoted BAA, they quoted Glaxo. It seems to me, the first question is, how much, on a scale of 0 to 100, how much of construction is actually done in this modular way in the UK at present? Secondly, if I was a client, if I was working for a company, and the CEO said to me, would you look after the construction? We need a new building and so on. It would seem to me I'd have dozens of examples of modular construction. So the question in my mind is, well, why isn't this already happening?
I think it gets back to what I said earlier, in terms of the commercial reality. The way the industry works is, if you would like a building, you normally appoint a team of professionals, probably led by the architect, the designers, who will want to design in the traditional way. The more hours they spend designing, the more revenue they make. Whereas if they do a plug-and-play, modularised, componentised system, I would expect very, very likely that their fee income would decline quite substantially, because they are, as gentlemen said there, they're putting together a series of components to achieve an output specification. So you've got quite a lot of commercial tension here. But if I could just go back to the earlier...
Can I say in that case, are you not looking for a Walmart or an Amazon to come along and say, we will take the initiative? To Baroness Young's question, a leader. I mean, if you had a leader,
I think you're
a
absolutely
disruptor in the industry.
Yes, and I think it's most likely to come from overseas. It's most likely to come from perhaps China, who are looking at very serious technologies there, including 3D printing of concrete structures. They think they've actually built a 20-storey office block. So I think we will see that silver bullet of an organisation in the UK, because of the fragmented and the commercial relationships. It's just so difficult. But I think that's what possibly might happen. I think the other thing that is really driving part of the conversation today is that there is a chronic skill shortage looming, and obviously with Brexit we know that might get a whole lot worse in the next sort of 18 months or so.
I think sorry to interrupt, we're coming to skills later.
Yeah, but I think getting back to why would you use off-site, if I was a client, I would be thinking of security of resource to build my project. If I'm thinking these guys use off-site, they don't need a lot of resource, I'd be very much talking to the clients who are utilising these techniques.
Okay, thank you. Lord Fox.
We've talked about clients quite a lot, and we've talked about different sectors, and it seems to me there's a distinct difference between the commercial sector and the residential sector. And yet, Dr. Williamson, you said just in your evidence now, almost exasperated, and still they build it with bricks. And I wonder if that's perhaps because the people buying the houses want the houses built from bricks, and what actual market research has gone into what people want. And if I was buying a new house, I would not buy it with a technique that's only been around for 5 years, because history has proven that in many residential situations that tends not to be as good as it promises, perhaps. So how can you convince not just the house builders, but the people who buy the houses, that perhaps they don't want a brick-built house? What is it that would convince me as a consumer, as a buyer of a house?
Well, that's really interesting. So I go back to my first point actually about one of the barriers, I think, is perception in terms of the quality. So there is that. You will straight away think about a property that you saw perhaps as a child, which was not the best quality. You'll think about things like Ronan Point. And then there is another side to this, which is the risk factor in terms of investors. So it is difficult to get. If you were a self-builder, for example, then you would struggle. You would also struggle to get a mortgage. So it's not a technical question that I can give an answer to, but I think there is a huge amount of work available now that demonstrates that if you go for a componentised approach, the materials are understood. You go back to the 1960s, we didn't really understand how the in-situ products were going to perform either. We made some fairly significant errors with reinforced concrete and salt. So I think
that's what I was thinking of.
if you lay out two plans, a brick built house and a prefabricated, highly engineered product, if one person, you cannot account for personal taste. However, if you've got something which is going to be a really nice use of space, you know that it is going to be energy efficient, and it's something that is going to be a sustainable product, then I think they're the kind of discussions that need to be had, and an understanding that this is not just bolted together panels, these are highly engineered products.
Is there a danger, if we've talked in other evidence about using public sector housing projects and those kind of big Ebbsfleet style to kick-start this technology, is there a danger that somehow that gets looked on as second-class housing because of the stigma of previous prefabs and other things, and because of, I think, a general perception, I don't have the data, and I wonder if anybody does, that people like brick-built buildings. So is there a danger of using public sector to kickstart this, that it kind of stigmatises it at the same time?
I suppose there is a risk, but if there's a risk and it's understood, then it can be mitigated. And actually, if you see some of the prefabricated, the new prefabricated houses, if a person likes brick built, just have some brick cladding on the outside that was actually prepared in the warm in a factory.
I was waiting for you to say that.
and you know, we talk about housing and residential, and there's part of us that will always focus on the 2-storey, 3-storey greenbelt estate that's been built by a housing developer. But actually, there's quite a significant amount of inner city urban PRS, the private rented model that's been developed. Most of the residential in London sort of falls into that category because of the density required. It needs to be towers. And I agree. I think if you look at some of the new sort of off-site solutions that are being driven in that market, I don't think you'd feel at all. Certainly something that's in the PRS market with,
I wasn't expressing a personal view. I was meaning...
No, but there's demonstrable quality there, and there's attraction that goes beyond just, I want the familiarity of bricks and mortar.
Lord Borwick.
Could you talk about the business models of construction industry? How would the cash flow change if you go for off-site manufacture? And presumably this is something that Dr. Williamson can speak with some knowledge, if not some caution, from your own experience within Laing O'Rourke. Is the cash flow better or worse to do it through your factory?
I think the models need to be significantly different. So Laing O'Rourke have invested in a number of manufacturing facilities. There is the precast concrete facility at Steatley, but there is also an MEP facility and another advanced manufacturing facility that's in the planning. So that investment has been made. However, for that model to work, there has to be a demand for the products that come from that factory. So effectively, we have to generate the market that keeps the factories busy, and it would where the industry needs to get to is that in addition to that push, there is a bit of a flipping of the balance, and there becomes more of a pull.
Okay, but for you have made your investment, and as you say, you have to wait and see whether or not you get the production. But for somebody who hasn't made the investment, for a new construction company, how would their cash flow alter?
I think
certainly in the short term, you've got a factory to buy and fit out. You've got a workforce to train, which is quite expensive. So I would say that you've got a number of years of investment. I think then it's all about the demand side and the continuity of that.
But if you didn't actually build the factory yourselves, but rather purchased.
You could obviously rent a factory, that would obviously smooth your cash flow out. But in terms of getting paid versus traditional, I'd say it's pretty neutral, to be honest, once you get going, because I'm assuming you guys get paid a certain stage payment through the construction cycle.
Indeed, I think that the key is having the visibility or either the visibility or the vision of a demand to support that investment.
I think your point is valid. I mean, you move from purely sort of looking at profit motives to looking at returns on capital employed, and the capital employed includes all of the working capital that you might have to outlay through the process, because if you're going to take complete ownership of a process from the sourcing of the raw materials through the design, through the fabrication, through the ultimate assembly and erection, then that will give you a higher level of capital employed than you would traditionally have in a construction model.
Baroness Morgan.
Can I move on to skills, which we did talk about with the previous people as well. I mean, obviously, you've already alluded to the fact, Mr. Kelly, that there's already a skills shortage, and we think that's going to get worse because of EU and an ageing skill base anyway. To what extent, I mean, our previous witnesses suggested that you could almost run this in parallel. In a sense, that will decline, but you should be developing a new skill set at the same time. Do you agree with that? And what range of new skills do you think are needed, and what do you think the opportunities are, in a sense, for filling the current skills gap with a new approach to offside?
So I think we've already started in terms of skills. There are a number of apprenticeships, assembly apprenticeships. I think there's a massive opportunity. So the current key skills, concreting, For civil engineering, concreting, reinforcement, fixing, carpentry, or going to the more domestic, the bricklaying, I think those are skills that if we can actually let go of them and not force people to work in those environments, then I think that's a positive thing. And the skills that we're looking at now vary. From an engineering perspective, we're actually looking at people who understand data. We talk about BIM, but there's a lot more to it. It's not just models and pictures. Data, you need to understand data engineering and data science. We have people in civil engineering, even construction engineering teams. We have data analysts. We have programmers who can work a little bit with the APIs. We have people whose jobs are... who can modify programs to suit our own particular needs. So people who are very software literate. We have people whose job it is to sit inside the office and do the construction sequencing before we go to site. So the engineering starts to look a lot different. And then when we get to what was construction, we now talk about manufacture. And even so I think today we're talking a lot about what we do in an actual manufacturing facility where it's components which come off an assembly line. But even on a normal construction site, we will offline as much as we can, and we'll create components in a controlled environment. So it's much more like manufacturing. And then you have fewer people who are on the construction site doing the assembly.
So in terms of the apprenticeships you were just talking about, what level are they? What are they coming to you at 18 or 16 or 16? So
16. A lot. We can get a lot out of people who've just come from school. An awful lot,
and including in all of these data areas. You develop them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we see that the traditional construction skills that you see on site, some of them will transfer directly into an off-site environment. But what might change is the mobility. If you think that, for example, London is a core site for construction activities, it will not be a core site for off-site manufacturing. The off-site manufacturing are likely to be in different places. Our facilities are in the Midlands and in the North, but we all work ostensibly in London. So, when you're talking about moving people, even with transferable skills, from a construction site in London, they may not be have that same availability in the geography that they start.
Lord Fox.
The world you just described to me, Dr. Williamson, is alluring, but when I walk past the building sites in London, I still see people up to their ankles in mud, plaiting rebar on site in order to create reinforced concrete structures. So how much of what you described is real and actually happening in scale, and how much of it is still aspirational?
I don't know the figures in terms of reality versus aspiration. There are certainly projects which have been so the London projects, for example. I think in the document that Laing submitted, we talk about one of our high-rise projects, 251, which was fully componentised, but that was a landmark project for us. So all of the elements. So
is that the reinforced concrete component?
The reinforced
as well. Yeah.
The reinforced concrete, the MEP, the cladding. So the components came from various places around the country, and they were assembled in a very tight London site. So we get rid of as much as possible things like the reinforcement fixing and the wet trades. So the in situ concrete, plastering, finishes, things like that are all done off site. But it's not the world. It is the world that we want to live in.
The world to come, rather than the world as we currently have. Yeah.
And can I add to Martin's point about the geography? It's not just that these components come from different places. They're actually made by different people, or they have the potential to be made by different people. There's a massive opportunity to tap into the diversity agenda once you start building things in a factory away from the traditional construction site.
Lord Hunt.
While the others were voting, I got the vote late, so I was going to ask you some questions. And you told me that at the Hinkley Point nuclear power station, they will be reaching at some point 10,000 people on that site. So how many of those would be apprentices?
I didn't research that figure. But I could provide that. There is so both the EDF and the contractors on the site have made significant investments in apprenticeships. I know that we're working closely with Bridgewater College and Exeter University who are running those apprenticeships for us.
So you will be, as it were, instrumental in producing a very large number of apprentices.
Yeah. We've actually have we're about to start a digital engineering apprenticeship, which is something like BIM. It gives people.
So will these big projects like this be one of the ways in which we engage people to generate lots more apprentices?
I believe so, and I also believe that people will go away from projects like this with a very clear idea of how they want to work on their future projects.
That's very interesting.
Baroness Neville-Jones.
I want to ask you the following. In the previous session, we heard that quite a lot of integrated team building is desirable and necessary, if you're going to have a successful project, which rather suggests that over time you get consolidation of these teams accustomed to working with each other. And then we also heard, and I couldn't entirely reconcile these two bits of evidence, that in fact the advent of off-site manufacturing would actually give a great opportunity for the expansion of the skills base and the factories around the country, and we would be able to, in effect, both create variety and be able to take advantage of greater variety, which rather suggests that actually there would be a great deal more ad hocery in who you chose to work with. Where do you think it's going yourselves?
My view is that I think you've picked up on a key point. Is that you say we introduce ourselves as a structural steel provider. We are in a bit of a silo, and I think that the real opportunity, and we've seen it. Our organisations of two organisations you wouldn't ordinarily see working side by side have in a factory environment built the canopies for London Bridge, which are a combination of structural steel, a cladded roof, and the ME&P required for the lighting, so that they get craned in overnight and plug and play. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about. But that's unusual. It's unusual that we would have ME&P and structural steel and cladding in the same building, working alongside one another as three separate organisations. But that's what needs to happen, and it needs to happen more widely than just 2 or 3 times. It needs to be much more wide-scale than that.
So you say that needs to happen. So what kind of structure of the industry would be likely to give us that greater likelihood?
I personally think it will be, like we said earlier, I think it will be outsiders from the Far East, China, who have developed a product that they can sell, that is fast, quick, safe, and meets all the requirements of the users. And I think it will go down certain product lines, office blocks, maybe residential, etc., etc. I think that's the only way it can happen, where they've absolutely designed this, they worked out how to build it very quickly, safely, meeting the required building standards, etc. And I think that's quite likely to happen, and that will use robotics on site potentially to actually build it. I mean, if you go online on YouTube now, you can see some quite a bit of R&D happening around the world using robotics to build houses.
I mean, can't those techniques be reshored?
I think we're a little bit. We're still in the sort of research phase rather than the sort of development phase at the moment. But I think it's not unreasonable to think in 20 years' time, there's a lot of tasks will be done by robots.
Oh yes, yeah. But I mean, why should the UK be such a laggard? Why does it have to come via the Chinese or the Indians?
I think there are a few self-help options, but they require us, the industry, and everyone around it.
And the client?
Driven by the client. But we need to focus on collaborative working. I think if we can sort of focus on which... I understand where David's coming from, because that's quite a big ask from where we are. And if we can focus on that sort of collaborative working, and there are a couple of contracting models that are available that do that, it's just in practice we find that kind of goes against the grain, and that's the hardest bit to break. It's the mindset.
Lord Valence, and then Lord Griffiths.
quickies. One, if it were to come from China, I mean, do you envisage big volumetric stuff being shipped in from China, or would you see the manufacturing being here?
No, I think obviously the aggregate and all the very heavy stuff, if you like, would come locally, but that's not the brains. The brains is how you assemble all that into your finished product. So I think the techniques would come from there.
Yes.
And then you know, the actual.
So you say the techniques would come from China?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
and another thing which is not entirely related, but on the skills thing, when we're talking about trade skills, but what about the other end of the skills? What about the marketing and commercial skills? I mean, to a sort of simple onlooker like me, you've got a product which looks to be cheaper, better, gives value for money, and there ought to be, you know, additional returns to the consumer and whoever in this lot. And all right, there's some technical difficulties of getting there, but part of it is surely it's actually marketing this stuff, isn't it? I mean, once you've invested in plant and you've got that capital, which is now a sunk cost, it's how do you sell this stuff and commercially, in what way, to residential or other contractors?
Sure. I think what the problem is we're not, there's not one part of the industry who is really responsible for selling almost a consumer product. It is so fragmented. So the client is choosing a multidisciplinary team of consultants and of trade contractors, and therefore none of us are selling that sort of product.
Yeah.
Because if we could have that product, it's very easy then to sell it. So its benefits in terms of speed, quality, price, all those things. We're just part of this very fragmented process that comes together to build buildings in the UK.
A full off-sited solution will not necessarily be the cheapest option. A client will be buying something else. They'll be buying quality and certainty of programme, reliability, and a whole life cost.
And value for money.
Yes.
Yes. If you can produce something that performs. Less energy, less this, less that.
Indeed. Yeah. So it's moving away. It's something that moves away from that initial capital cost to a more whole life thinking.
Lord Griffith.
Chairman, I'm still struggling as to why this thing isn't happening quicker. The area I know best of all is finance and banking. And if we went back to the 1980s, you found that the City of London was in a whole lot of separate silos. The discount houses, commercial banks, abstracting houses, merchant banks, as many kinds of asset management companies, jobbers, brokers, and so on. Today, the whole thing has come together in one. And it seems to me that what held it back was regulation. And I just wondered to what extent, given that there are silos, and given that you have things like the Grenfell Tower and so on, so you have to be very, very concerned about regulation, that in the end, for, say, a steel structurer to go into something to do with roofing or something like that, there's a risk element in trying to put it together. That's one thing. The second thing is, in the end, it was the advent of foreign competition coming into the city which actually changed it. And I just wondered to what extent in this industry we have a similar, that regulation is actually quite important as something which is a barrier, or at least something which slows down the process of integration.
I think it's fair to say it's probably something that doesn't exist currently, because you're right. In every single silo, the reason why there are silos there is because it takes 20, 30 years to be a specialist in these areas and understand every single aspect of the regulations. Moving out of that comfort zone into somebody else's sphere of expertise is very hard for one organisation to do. Now, you can do that through collaboration, which is the right way to do it, because trying to learn a 20, 30 year is very ineffective. But as I say, the examples of collaboration, true collaboration in the construction industry, are not as many as you might imagine.
Okay.
I think there's something to add to that, which is that for this to work, you don't have to learn everybody else's specialism. I think what would make a real difference is that the change in the procurement practices, so more a fairer or different sharing of risk and practices that encourage a long-term alliancing between industry partners who have the different required skills, which is not the way that construction tends to be procured now.
But all of the component parts are there.
Yes.
It just requires that mindset and capability to bring it all together.
And I would just add one thing, and that is with the City of London, it was also the inflow of capital with the American institutions which enabled it to happen.
Just on procurement practices, are these self-imposed, or are they a function of regulation?
Certainly the industry has always been very competitive, and therefore I would say continual benchmarking of cost is the thing.
It's a straight
government obviously, yes. I mean, there are rules and regulations that absolutely insist that there are sort of three prices for the job, if you like. But there have been frameworks in the past that have been successful in driving innovation. I'm taken way back in the midst of time to the Decent Homes programme, which I was involved with, where we were let 7-year contracts to upgrade the social housing. And surprise, surprise, we worked with the same people, the integrated project teams you spoke of earlier. And we actually got incredibly good. We drove innovation because it was in our interests. And I would say where you've seen innovation in this industry, it's through large government programmes, be it housing, be it whatever, because the supply chain gets good at doing stuff, and you start to see that benefit. Now, I think the problem is these programmes come to an end and some of that innovation just gets lost. That's the shame. So what can government do? I think it is to trust the industry a bit more, to actually give the industry innovation targets in return for longer term certainty frameworks to allow you to make that investment, to reap rewards of spending a longer time as a partner.
I can understand that, but leaving aside government procurement at the moment, just looking at the market, which is the private market, what I'm really after is, are there regulations in terms of procurement in that market which are constraining things, or are these procurement issues things that ought to be dealt with by the private sector itself, and perhaps it's not happening because of the silo structure?
In my view, it's not driven by regulation. It's driven by the commercial environment in which we work, and it's driven as much by. You can't talk about the supply chain. The supply chain could be 40 different organisations, 40 different trades, of which there are 3 to 4 competitive tenders for every single package before you start getting to component parts. So there are multiple layers of procurement. And as you go through this, and there can be at different times,